I'll ask Dragon. Can get it. Or
Learn.
is it? No. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Estelle Massé from Access Now. I'm EU policy analyst working out of our Brussels office, and I'm really happy to welcome you on this last day of RightsCon. Thank you for being here so early in the morning. I think Edward Snowden helped us there. I'm not going to be speaking too long and let the talented people to my left enough time to talk to you about this very important topic that we really wanted to cover at RightsCon, the issue of migrants, refugees, and how they're affected by surveillance and what they are, the human rights protection that should apply to them. In order to set a little bit the debate that we're going to have this morning, which would be particularly focused on the current issue that the European Union is facing, but also looking at the issue from a global perspective, I would like to provide you some with a little bit of context of what's the political situation in the EU at the moment in order to help the general understanding of some of the issues we might be mentioning. As you probably know, the European Union and most of its countries are being faced with the arrival of a massive amount of refugees for about a year now, mostly from Syria, leaving the country for obvious reason of to flee from the threats that they're facing in their country. And while they're entering the EU, they're facing with a lot of challenges in order to first be able to stay there, or in order to have a normal life there, or even by integration in the European society itself. In addition to that, we're seeing a response from the European governments, particularly targeted at them, that is, instead of putting forward measures in order to integrate them in the society, are developing or putting forward legislative proposals that particularly target them for surveillance and discriminatory measures in order to keep an eye on them or trying to limit the flow of migrants. I won't go into too much detail because our panelists will provide you with a lot of exact information on what's happening. But I'll go directly to our first speaker, Dragana Karim from the Localization Lab, who will speak about the challenges that migrants and refugees face as they're entering Europe. And what can we do probably in order to help raise awareness in this situation? Yeah.
Thanks, Estelle. First, to note that this is not a novel problem, that we've had an issue of refugees lacking any net of protection many times, even since the EU crisis last fall. What we have is an issue of security and protection sort of mirroring each other, that we have, by November, it was about 800,000 refugees coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Sudan, I think, make up the majority, about 80% of the countries where the refugees are coming from. And out of that, we have no idea where people are going to. Having said that, EU does have obligations to these people. The Schengen free travel zone has really been broken since beginning of fall to the incoming refugees. What they're facing is smugglers, traffickers. They're facing not knowing where to stay. They're facing xenophobia. They're facing hate crimes, amongst many other things. There's about 10,000 children that are completely missing or that have been disappeared, according to UNICEF, because there's no registrar. There's no accountability to where people are going. Aside from that, we have thousands of women that are missing, mostly through Romania, Bulgaria, through the Balkan route. UNHCR has some evidence that this is due to human trafficking, but then again, because there's no net of protection, not even community-based protection systems, we don't know where people are going, and hence comes the issue of surveillance for protection, as well as for security. Since November, of course, the attacks that happened in Paris, one of the attackers, there was what later was to be found, a fake Syrian passport found next to them, as if someone goes on an attack carrying their passport for some reason. But that is a different issue on itself. But the effects of that have been that Europe has been like, we need to increase surveillance. We need to stop the influx of refugees coming in. So it's been a lot more harsh, I think, on the refugee population since November. And of course, attacks last week in Brussels.
So basically what we're facing in the EU is a flow of migrants that are going to Europe in the help of a solution. They're fleeing their country because of conflict. They're going to Europe in the hope that Europe is a standard setter for human rights, has this vision that they will find peace and being able here to probably build a better future for them. They arrive in Europe and they're faced with rejection from population because of misinformation in the press on what is the intention of refugees in Europe. There is fear-mongering about the number of refugees here and their intention, and the fact that many of them might be terrorists hiding in the crowd and they might be here to destabilize our democracies. And we have this very complicated situation where many families are first risking their life to cross the Mediterranean, and if they make it alive to Europe, they are basically not welcome, and the governments are failing to respond to their human rights criteria and protect this population in need of help. And I'd like to go to Mike Posner here to explain to us what are the human rights obligation of the European countries and the human rights obligation of countries in general globally when migrants and asylum seekers are coming to your country for help. What should be the response, and where is European Union failing particularly here?
So thank you. I just say, just by way of introduction, I'm now at the Stern Business School, running a center on business and human rights, but I worked for 3.5 years in the State Department. So I'm presenting in some ways a perspective on government and of government. The obligation of states is, under the Refugee Convention, not to return people to face persecution. That's the 51 Refugee Convention. And it's being I would say, ignored in the extreme. But let me put it in a broader context, if I will, and I'll come back to that. We live in a world today where there are more refugees and displaced people than any time since World War II. There's 60 million people that are either internally displaced or refugees. 40 million of them internally displaced within their own countries. 20 million of them have been forced to leave across the border. That's an extraordinary number, and it reflects the fact, one, that there's a lot of conflict in the world, but also it reflects a system that's on overload. The agencies like the UN High Commissioner's Office for Refugees is now vastly underfunded and unable to do what it's intended to do, which is to protect these people who are in extremely vulnerable circumstances. The situation of the Syrians in particular has gotten a lot of attention, but there are huge refugee populations in Afghanistan, Iraq, a range of African countries, Somalia, Nigeria, throughout West Africa. With the Syrians, there are 4 million people that have left the country, another 6 million people internally displaced. That means that 10 million people in a country with 18 million people overall are no longer at home. The neighboring countries, Turkey in particular, which has taken about 2 million of those refugees, have taken a disproportionate load in terms of burden. Lebanon, 1 million. Jordan, a country that can ill afford it, 600,000. And about 1 million of these people have gone to Europe. But the European reaction has been shockingly poor, with the exception of Germany, which has taken hundreds of thousands. About 100,000 people have now gotten asylum in Germany, but there are probably 700,000 or 800,000 people that are going to apply this year. And Chancellor Merkel, uniquely, I would say, in Europe, has said this is a responsibility we have to take seriously. It puts her in jeopardy politically. The Swedes have taken about 65,000 people, but after that it drops off dramatically. And the Swedish government is in trouble now because they've taken these people. I just want to give you a little flavor. So, you know, the Europeans, both the French and the British, have taken 7,000 refugees. The French have said we'll take 12,000 over the next 2 years. The British have said they'll take 20,000 over 5 years. These numbers are vastly inadequate given the size and scope of the problem. But here's the U.S. number. We live in the United States, a country that has a rich tradition of taking refugees. We've taken a grand total of 1,500 Syrian refugees. 1,500 over the last 5 years. In 2011, we took 25. In 2012, we took 47. Not 1,000, 47 refugees from Syria. Last year, it went up to 1,500. The president has said we're going to take 10,000 refugees in the coming year, but there is absolutely no way that's going to happen. Government's not prepared to do that. There's no system in place. It takes 2 years to go through the government processing. So as somebody who worked in government, and as I watch what's happening, to me it's absolutely shocking, and there is almost no political discussion about it. On the Democratic or the Republican side in our political campaign, except, of course, the politics of fear. And so I just want to say a word about that. What's happening here is that the dominant discussion is about security and the threat of ISIS and the threat that terrorists are going to come into Europe or come into the United States. The politics of fear is engulfing our political systems, both in Europe and North America. And it is something that I think people who are concerned about human rights ought to be raising concerns about. Never mentioned in debates. It's never mentioned, it's rarely mentioned in political discourse. And the discussion in Europe is now all about how to keep people from coming to Europe. In the name of fighting smuggling and trafficking, Europe and NATO, which the U.S. is part of, have now sent an armada of Navy vessels to sit in the Aegean Sea between Turkey and Greece and to prevent people from coming. It's framed in terms of anti-smuggling. It's anti-refugee. I worked 30-some years ago on trying to stop Haitian interdiction in the Caribbean. The United States stopped Haitian refugees from coming to Florida. In the 70s, the Malaysians stopped Indo-Chinese refugees from coming to their shores. This is the third generation of interdiction, interception, and it's being framed in terms of refugee protection by virtue of preventing smuggling. So coming back to your question, I'm sorry to have gone off track, but governments have an obligation here not to return people to face persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opposition. There are literally millions of people whose lives now in the world and in Syria in particular and have left Syria whose lives are now at risk. And it is an affirmative obligation of all of our governments, Western governments, U.S., Canada, and the European states in particular, to take that responsibility seriously.
Actually, can I respond to that? Well, a couple of notes. Since, while this is true that Chancellor Merkel has had a very, very flexible, I think, policy towards refugees, Germany was the first country to close its borders on September 13th, quoting, or rather noting, unmitigated and erratic influx of refugees coming in, followed by, a month later, by Austria and another 6 EU, or what are Schengen travel zone countries. So I was wondering how you would, and another question to that, sorry. As somebody who's gone through the refugee process in America myself, actually 20 years ago this week, it took about 3 or 4 months 20 years ago to come to the States, applying for, not as an asylum seeker, but applying from Bosnia to come to the States. And recently I've helped with paperwork for a young lady to come from Afghanistan, which also took about 3 or 4 months. So what specifically is preventing us from helping Syrian refugees coming in? Because it's not necessarily the process itself. There is, I think, a lot of xenophobia when it comes to this population coming in. And this is not a secret. This is something that's been publicly stated by governors and senators back in the fall, pledging we will not take any Syrian refugees. And I'm wondering what specifically is it that's preventing us from bringing in 25,000 people like Canada did, which is disproportionately.
Yeah. First of all, on the German point, what you say is right about their closing the border, but they've also allowed to come in something in the order of 800,000 people, and it is so much greater. You know, Germany and France are next door to each other. They're more or less the same size. Germany a little bit bigger, but Germany's taken 800,000 and France has taken 7,000. You know, where are the Danes? Where are the Dutch? Where's the rest of Europe? Where's the UK? So I'm sympathetic to the notion that everybody ought to be opening their borders, but I think Germany and Sweden have really distinguished themselves, and other European countries are completely paralyzed on these issues and are totally in a defensive mode. The issue of why it takes so long and why the system isn't working, it's totally right now. I mean, I worked in the government and I worked on refugee issues for a lot of years. The system is not designed now to expedite or really to deal in a serious way with Syrians coming to the United States. The presumption has been that they're not going to come. This is a European problem and a Middle East problem. And so it's totally, there's no mechanism in place. Years ago, we let in close to 1 million Indo-Chinese. We let in 800,000 Soviet Jews. We let in close to 1 million Cubans. We did it because somebody made a political decision. These are going to be things we're going to do. We're going to set up the mechanism. The people in Homeland Security that deal with asylum questions have never been given the directive, this is a priority. We've got to figure out where and how we do it. And until that happens, even the president said we're going to take 10,000 people this year. It's not going to happen We're going to take maybe a couple of thousand, but it's going to be through a system that's basically set up to go slow, to prevent anybody that's a security risk. We should do that, but the assumption is really, the presumption is they're not going to.
How can we make it an American problem?
Well, you know, one way would be to get people in political campaigns to be talking about it. It's not an issue. It's not. You know, Senator Sanders said several months ago, I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to give a number because I don't know enough of the facts. What more facts do you need? There's a lot of. I just gave a lot of facts. Secretary Clinton has said 60,000, which is a better number than 10,000, which is a better number than 1,200. But again, it's not part of our discourse. The discourse is dominated. I don't want to get into the politics of America right now, but the reality is the politics of fear dominate. We have candidates running for president who say, we don't want any Muslims coming in. What is that about? How does that correspond to Americans' history? And so until that's challenged, not just by saying, oh, that's bad, but being specific about saying there's a huge crisis in the world. Refugees are in dire straits. Europe isn't standing up as it should, and the United States needs to be a leader in this. We need to lead by example, and that's something that I think people across the political spectrum ought to be saying. That's our history, it's our tradition, it's where most of us came from. And why did it all of a sudden become the day that we decided to take 1,200 people?
Beyond the numbers, one important issue also to look at is the condition of living that the countries are offering to the refugees coming in. In the case of Germany, there is a lot of centers that have been built for the refugees. Not all of them are able to be sleeping on those centers, and Germany is also an isolated case because if you have ever heard the name of the place where the refugees are being put in France, it's called the jungle. And it's referred to that because they literally sleep in tents outside in the cold in the north of France where it's there is a lot of rain. The camp has already caught fire a numerous amount of time, putting at risk the families of further dangers. In many other parts of Europe, they're literally sleeping on rail tracks or next to very dangerous facilities, or if they can, near the walls that countries like Hungary or Austria are building in order to stop the flow of migrants. And not only are the numbers that Europe is ready to accept extremely low, but also the condition where they expect refugees to live there are absolutely deplorable. So the response has been incredibly poor, but also incredibly adequate also in terms of further steps. A recent summit in Brussels where we were expecting a real political response to this issue after many and many months of debates ended up with a decision to send, as it was said in the press, send back most of these refugees back to Turkey, when most of them actually didn't either come from Turkey or didn't cross through Turkey. So I would like to turn to Denise to talk to us about the situation in Turkey and how, from the Turkish perspective, is the European discoursing and how is the Turkish government responding to that that message from the European Union of sending back the refugees to the country?
Sure. Thanks, Estelle. I'm Deniz, and I work with Access as a policy fellow, and I'm a graduate student at Oxford, and I'm from Turkey. So as Mike Posner was saying, there are more than 2 million refugees, mostly from Syria, that are currently in Turkey, and this number is expected to rise following the recent deal with the European Union. Actually, it's next week that Turkey is expected to receive the first wave of refugees that are returned from Greece who were denied asylum applications when they were in Greek islands or in Greece. And protests are happening as we speak in islands around Greece today against this deal and its consequences, which will be realized very soon. And there are a lot of issues with this deal, as Estelle was mentioning. There are issues of international humanitarian law, but apart from all of that, there are issues of safety, because is Turkey really a safe country of asylum when it's in itself going through a lot of issues right now, and we also have experienced a lot of terror attacks, even though they weren't reported maybe as heavily in the Western media. So today, actually, this is not my area of expertise, honestly, obviously, because I'm from Turkey. It's a part of my daily life to think about these issues. But I was doing some research, and today I found out that Amnesty International reported today on illegal deportations from Turkey to Syria, and the director for Central Asia and Europe of Amnesty International said that they are witnessing the creation of a fortress Turkey, kind of like a copycat version of the fortress Europe that we're seeing. And tied to that, there's like actually something very important. In Turkey, for refugees to get basic services, they need to register. And this ties to what you were speaking about in terms of not knowing where people are. In Turkey, when refugees register, they might also face, as seen in the reports published today, deportations to back to Syria. And actually, there was research done in 2013 by the Turkish Disaster and Emergency Management Authority, which found out that a third of the urban refugees in Turkey are not registered. And I take a look at the reports in more detail, but there was incidents of kidnappings for ransom among the people who especially are living in the border areas. There are around 200,000 of displaced people within the border region between Turkey and Syria. So there are a lot of issues of security, as you mentioned. And then what about the situation in Turkey for the refugees that are able to stay there or live there? As I said, registration is necessary to access hospital services, education if it's available. Obviously, Turkey is being, in a way, very like, we are welcoming refugees, and we even use the schools after the Turkish students. We have education in Arabic, for example, so there are definitely good things happening as well. But what about the issues in terms of digital rights? For example, we have mandatory SIM registration in Turkey, which means that you have to present national identification to register any SIM cards if you are a foreigner as well. First of all, this undermines anonymous communication, and I think this definitely creates discriminatory effects, because this might exclude users from having a SIM card to connect to their loved ones and say that they're safe, because it's a very hard and bureaucratic process, and foreigners are limited to having only 3 SIM cards registered on their passports if they have a passport with them. And in addition to that, there is also mobile phone registration. So let's say that you have a mobile phone that you brought with you. You have to register it by paying a fee and then also tying it to your passport number or your national ID number, which I think is a huge problem in itself in terms of using communication services to begin with. And up until a few days ago, we had no personal data protection law. In Turkey, we have constitutional protections for privacy and right to data protection, but there was no actual law. Turkey wasn't one of the 100-something countries that had a data protection law. And since a few days ago, we now have one, and there will be similar mechanism similar to the EU. But what has been happening for the past few years, we don't know, because, for example, we know that countries collaborate with each other for law enforcement, national security. For example, the latest transparency report by Microsoft shows that the highest number of law enforcement requests came from Turkey. There were around 40,000 requests around the world coming from law enforcement agencies for user information, and around 10,000 of them came from Turkey, which was the highest number, followed by France, the US, UK, and Germany. So these are all important issues, and I guess this is, sorry for sharing maybe too much information, but I think this shows also the multi-sided nature of the problems when it comes to the privacy of the refugees, and also to the other side of the coin, the security. So.
Just to add a couple of notes to that, when you are registered as a refugee, when you leave your country, until you leave your country, you're not a refugee. You're an eternally displaced person. Once you leave, my research, in my other life, has been on UNHCR efforts to teach people what it is, what a registration does for you. Which is supposed to allow you free legal aid, in some cases monetary assistance, shelter, food, water and sanitation, and communications has just recently been part of this package of aid package to refugees, or things that you're entitled to as a refugee, right? They've done a pretty poor job of telling refugees or notifying refugees what they're entitled to. This is to Iraqi refugees coming to Syria and Lebanon about 8-9 years ago, and more recently in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan to Syrian refugees coming in, which is why we see a fraction, and when I say a fraction, about a third or a fourth in each of these countries of refugees who are there versus those who are, about a third or fourth are registered with UNHCR and know that they are entitled to certain things. And this ties into what Mike said earlier. This is largely due to them being extremely underfunded and not asking for more money because they can't even serve the population that they are supposed to serve originally. And secondly, Turkey has a policy of keeping refugees within a 10-kilometer border, larger border within the country. And this is not something just with Syrian refugees or Iraqis, but this has been true since '92, I think, since the influx of Kurds coming in. Which is why, I mean, when you look at data from UNHCR or UNICEF, there are a lot of, majority of kids are going to school around that are in the camps around Kilis or Gaziantep, but they are within this kind of buffer zone, they are allowed to leave, but by allowed to leave, I mean, if they escape, and they're allowed to move around. By international law, they're allowed to, even freedom of movement, right? But I think that kind of explains a bit what you were saying, Denise.
As we are moving to the issue of privacy, we have a few questions here, and I will also be taking questions to the room. So I know we have one question here. Just to explain a little bit, we'll take the first question. We have had a lot of debate on privacy around refugees because we're faced with this dichotomy that a lot of the measures that are being put in place are targeted at creating a tracking of migrants. In particular, this new project in Europe that will be released very soon, that it's called the Smart Border, which has the objective of identifying the so-called overstayers in the European Union, which affect particularly the asylum seekers and the refugees. And at the same time, we've seen an issue in some countries such as Italy in failing to register properly the refugees in order to provide them with the needed assistance and the needed legal help and social help. And those have led to the increase of human trafficking as well. So we're in the issue where at the same time, there is in some part, the registration process leads to a violation of privacy of the refugees, and in other part, the lack of registration put them at physical risk. So I'll be taking the first question for the panel. Can we ethically distinguish between privacy rights of citizens and those of refugees/asylum seekers? And then I will be taking the question of the lady in the back. Do we have a microphone? Would you mind coming closer? Maybe. I'm sorry.
Say that again, sorry. Can you say that again? I don't think we...
Okay, I will repeat your question to make sure everybody in the room heard it. The first question was to speak more about the surveillance affecting the refugees from Syria, specifically to malware put in their device. And the second question, if I got it clearly, is about specifically the protection for women. That there's been a lot of reports on the fact that there were greater protection that was needed, and whether this has happened or not. So, 3 questions to all of you. Do you want to start, Jurgana?
Can I start from the back, from this last question? I think we're talking about threats of sexual violence to women, which, yes, and not just in Germany, really all over, especially in Indomani recently, where we have 10,000 people who are stuck in this sort of legal and many other kinds of limbo. There was a case recently of a young girl of 7 or 8 who was attacked, which, to bring some cultural context, this is how many other cases are not being reported. There is each sort of aid sector on water and sanitation or education is monitored by a different UN agency, and UNHCR is responsible for the protection sector, which has been failing these women greatly. Largely, I would say because there's very little, I think, legal. When somebody is in between, maybe Mike can give more context to this. Somebody's in between borders. There's very little legal protection that can be given there. And secondly, I think UNHCR has refused to work with this new EU deal, leaving these people to community-based protection mechanisms, which again, UNHCR is supposed to be pushing behind. So I would say nothing is being done.
We're sort of having a couple of different conversations here. One is about the obligation of states to take people or to be part of a global solution in terms of people who are desperately leaving a country. And the answer is that the affirmative obligation of states is not crystal clear. They have an obligation once they're in their custody not to return them, but until people show up on their border, there's no affirmative stance that says they have to take people. Second conversation, and my point is not a legal point or a surveillance point, it's just saying that I don't think Western governments are doing enough to affirmatively accept people who are in desperate shape. The second question, or the second issue, which you raised in a number of the other comments that we made, was about what happens when they actually get into these Western countries. How are they being treated? And are governments doing enough to protect them? Again, clearly not. And there are probably a range of issues relating to surveillance. There's obviously relating, as you're describing, to mistreatment of women in particular. So many of these refugees are women and children. They're vulnerable populations. National mood in Europe is not very positive now. It's very negative. And so they're ostracized. They're put in isolated places and they're mistreated. And the governments are on the defensive because, again, politics of fear. There's a sense, why'd you take these people in the first place? So those are really challenging issues for governments. I don't know that any government's doing a stellar job, but they're certainly aware that there's a problem there. And then there's a third set of issues, which this panel is supposed to be about, relating to surveillance. That's your, I guess, your first question. But to me, you know, technology is both a tool to help figure out where are these people, who are they, and to get them out of harm's way. And then there's a range of questions about whether governments, either the Syrians or the countries where they land, are, you know, messing around with their privacy rights. I have no doubt that that's happening across the board. But again, if I were to prioritize, I'd say we have life and death issues. How do you get these people out of harm's way? Then you got to deal with how are they being treated once they arrive. The surveillance issues we should be mindful of, but in the scheme of things, I think that, you know, those are things we have to operate on a parallel track. I'm not saying they're not important, but I think we have a desperate need now to try to figure out how to get people into safe places.
I guess I can take the first question on the screen. Well, I'm not a philosopher, so I don't think I can say yes, we can or no, we can't. But I don't think that we should, because the rights we're talking about are universal. So I don't think that we should discriminate between any type of citizenship or documentation when we talk about right to privacy, for example. But at the same time, even though all countries have human rights commitments, when it comes to national laws, we see that there's sometimes separation between the citizens and foreign nationals, as we see, for example, in the US. So unfortunately, in practice, what we hope isn't always the reality. But would you like to also comment on that?
Yes, well, I fully agree with your statement that there is no distinction for refugees or citizens. We're all entitled to a right to privacy. That's a universal right. And in the case of violation of privacy, it's wrong for a country to surveil their citizen and put them under surveillance. And it's even more problematic when you target vulnerable population that are coming to you for help, that are hoping that you will welcome them because they're fleeing a conflict that you might have something to do about also. They're coming for help. And the response you have is that first, you might move them to another country, but you will put them under surveillance. And that leads to one of the questions that has now showed up also here, where I was not aware of that, but it seemed that in Germany, some refugees were interrogated by the BND, which is the German Secret Services, in exchange for refuge. And how do we feel about that? So I would like to ask the panelists about that. I think my response is fairly obvious that, of course, it's completely wrong. And if you're coming to a country for help, that's where there is an issue. We're seeing people coming for help as a threat, and that's the wrong response here. So I'd like to hear more about that.
Where to go? There's a lot of missing information. Why were they interrogated? What were they interrogated about? I don't know where to start.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know who asked the question, but it would be interesting to know why the intelligence service is interrogating them rather than immigration authorities. That would be one question I would ask. Certainly government, again, wearing a government hat, government has a responsibility to ensure, protect security. That's a legitimate function. And whether it's a refugee or a permanent resident or a citizen, there's some things that government authorities can do, but under what authority is the, security service here interrogating a refugee? That seems to me like it's the wrong venue, it's the wrong people doing it. It doesn't mean that there's no right to ask the question.
The next question we have also builds on the issue of privacy. It's, what is the feasibility of applying blockchain technology to offer identity confirmation to refugees without documentation? Very specific question. If there is anyone particularly in the panel who wants to
Can you
explain?
give us what is the blockchain technology, and maybe give us a bit more of an explanation of the question?
Well, I'm not the best person to do that because I would not be able to explain it in a way that makes complete sense because I didn't get to that. There anybody in the room to help on that?
We just did a international development hackathon at MIT, Tufts, and Harvard, where the idea of using the blockchain technology is, and I'm not the best person to explain blockchain technology other than to say that it is a public ledger on the internet that's verified every 10 minutes or so. So it operates outside the existing legal structures, and it's a way that you can verify various things. It's used as the background for Bitcoin, used as a background for Bitcoin, but now it's being used for moving contracts back and forth and as a private international way to create some form of documentation. So the idea that you could put identity up there as a separate way of verifying identity other than documents is something that's being looked at and worked on. first for humanitarian purposes, but then it could actually even be used beyond humanitarian purposes to identify people's reputation, their capabilities, and even in an open world environment, get jobs and other types of things. So it operates outside the political sector, outside the government sector, but then you have the need to be able to accept that to create opportunities for people to move back and forth and work. So that it operates independent of the documentation itself.
Okay, maybe I think we'll leave the blockchain debate here in the sense, like, I'm sure any of us four can speak to that. But one of the things we wanted to do on that panel is also go a little bit beyond Europe and discuss other practices or measures that has been in place in other countries. So the EU debate is particularly important because of its relevance at the moment. But one issue that we've been discussed a lot in the news is the relationship between the United States and Latin America and Central America, and how people coming from South America in the U.S. are being treated as they arrive, and the security measures at the borders. We hear a lot about in Europe about this wall between the U.S. and Mexico, which is being used as an example and a reason for some EU countries, sort of a legitimacy for building that wall, saying that this model exists in other parts. I don't know if Mike, for instance, wants to speak a little bit about that.
Well, I'm not a fan of the wall, if that's what you're asking. Look, we've had a debate here for 50 years about refugee protection and how to treat people when they come across the border. There are some particularly egregious things that have gone on in the last several years with unaccompanied minors coming from Central America who've been returned without any kind of fair process. So that's a particular issue now relating to Latin America. But I think, again, I want to come back to something I said at the beginning. I think the broader issue, both for the U.S. and Europe, is how to reaffirm and reignite a notion of a humanitarian commitment to people who are desperate. Refugees are those who have forced to leave their homes. People don't leave their homes easily. And these are people who are leaving because of political or other kinds of persecution, ethnicity, race, religion, etc. And they're in desperate conditions. And if you treat this as a national security issue, inevitably you're going to be shutting the door on the great majority of these people. And I think the anxiety, I understand the anxiety. We live in a very insecure world. And I understand why European governments and the American government and others are now saying we need to be mindful of security. We need to know who's coming in. Totally legitimate. But if that's the only focus is on national security and there is not a corresponding recognition of an affirmative humanitarian obligation, then I think the reality is what I described before, which is that there are going to be many, many desperate people who are going to be left without protection, that are going to be pushed back from Greece to Turkey, that are going to be pushed back from the neighboring countries ultimately back into war zones. I think that's an unacceptable condition. So that's what I think we need to be focused on.
One of the issues that the audience seems to be interested in is the use of biometrics, which is one of the solutions that is also being explored in Europe. So we have two questions I think we can take into one. Is that there is an example in India where a law to create biometric database has been introduced. And another question raising the concern also of the ideas of using biometrics to track all refugees. Dragana, do you have anything to say on this?
Well, I have a comment to say on it. When it comes to food aid, World Food Program hands out chips or these cards, and biometrics are definitely used when you need to get your monthly. It's a different amount based on how big your family is or where you are, or in Lebanon or in Turkey. So when it comes to the aid side of the conversation, biometrics are being used already. Are they being misused? it's another, I think, bigger question. You mentioned the other day when we spoke about the French virtual border, or do you maybe want to tell us a little bit about that? Because that was really fascinating, and I think plays in here in this like conversation on security and protection, where it's something that can be used for good, and I don't know if it is.
Sure. So the program I was referring to when we discussed is a legislation that the European Union has been trying to put forward already 2 years ago, which is called a Smart Border Package, which initially is not targeted, let's say, at refugees. It's something in order to implement new types of visa control. This program is in addition to the 4 legislation we already have in place in the EU on visa programs, and is been done without assessment of the current program. So it's just a new database in addition to the 4 current databases that we have, in order to collect more data, including sensitive data for the first time, and a large range of biometrics data, in order to increase the number of information. And the stated goal is first to improve the identification of travelers when entering the EU, and detect those overstayers, as I mentioned before. The proposal was made 2 years ago and sent back by both the EU member states and the European Parliament for its lack of compliance with human rights and its increased cost. It's not going to be back on the table in the next months. And while France 3 years ago was extremely opposed to that idea and to that project, in light of the attacks that France faced last year, France has now become one of the biggest proponents of that measures, and is asking actually the European Commission, who is putting forward this legislation, to go one step further and include the registration of biometrics data, which at that point we don't know whether it will be limited to fingerprint or in a facial picture and retina. It's the 3 options are being looked at, and in the proposal might include all of the 3 or one of the 3 or just 2 of them. We'll find that out in a few months. France is asking that these types of control to be extended to European citizens as well, entering and leaving the EU and traveling in the EU, as well as refugees and asylum seekers. There is, of course, a lot of privacy risk. There is a lot of tracking involved. It's basically another surveillance database on top of some measures we already have. And it also contradicts the fundamental principle of freedom of movement under Schengen that Dragana was speaking before. For those of you that are not familiar with Schengen, it's one of the agreements at European level that allow for free movement within the Schengen area. Not movement, but also this undermines potentially the right to privacy. And this is quite problematic in the sense that it's been done without any proper research on whether this is really needed, whether this will achieve the goal that it's proposed to, but it's fundamentally going to create a large amount of database that is accessible. When the database is created, it's not only accessible for the purpose that the government are telling us it's being accessible, but also it can be accessed for misuse and for other purposes, which is the case for the already existing databases, and raise a lot of concern. And it's very problematic for European citizens, but we enjoy a pretty strong right to redress. Why it's problematic, we can fight in court to protect us, but it's even more problematic for vulnerable population, including migrants and asylum seekers. They're basically first faced with the fact that they want to stay alive, they want to find good living condition, and then when they arrive here, they're faced with even more abuse of their human rights.
Yeah, I think biometrics is very interesting because even Facebook, for example, uses face recognition. When you upload a photo, they say, oh, is this someone, like, is this Sally or something? And I guess, for example, as a non-US passport holder, every time I enter the US, I give my fingerprints and my photo is taken. So I think there's like a lot of already existing infrastructure for not only just refugees and migrants, but also for like non-nationals entering a country on a visa. And I guess, for example, in the case of India, when a measure like this is introduced at a national level, there should be a public debate about the privacy implications, as well as an understanding of the risks. Where is the database going to be? What will be the security protections of such database? So I guess without public debate on these, such measures will and might become problematic in the future.
Let me take a somewhat contrary view, or at least raise the issue. In a way, this whole conference is about the benefits of technology and the risks of technology. And of the risks often relate to privacy issues. This is an area in particular where we're dealing with people that have the least legal entitlement to rights because they're not citizens, they're not permanent residents, and they're attempting to come into countries where there's a great deal of anxiety about who they are. And so, again, this is not to say I don't have anxieties about the privacy. I do. But I think the real questions are going to be, how do you protect privacy rights in a manner that gives not only governments, but more important, their populations, a sense that the screening process for who gets in and who stays is sufficiently thorough that you prevent people coming in who are going to commit violent acts. The politics of fear is terrible. It's overblown, but it's not based on no empirical evidence. There have been attacks in Paris, in Brussels, in the United States, and elsewhere, and people are highly anxious. And so the challenge, I think, again, in this area in particular, is how do you give people confidence that their governments know enough and are making informed choices about who gets in and who stays in a way that also protects privacy. The question before about are citizens entitled to more privacy rights than refugees or asylum seekers? Well, it depends on where in the process they are, but certainly people who are out of status, who come to a country or who cross a border without status, have less legal rights. They have less of a remedy to enforce rights than people who are citizens. That having nothing to do with refugees or privacy. That's just a fact of law. And so I think we need to be aware of all of these things that are new technologies being used for, in effect, data gathering. And we need to try to figure out what are the rules in which those things don't infringe on privacy, but give governments the ability to say to their populations, these are people who we've vetted in a serious way and we are confident are really humanitarian cases, not people coming to harm us. These issues are not going to go away, and I'm afraid it's going the wrong way. Those numbers about how few are getting into the U.S. or France or in the U.K., it's all about people in those countries feeling we don't feel confident that our government can keep out the people that shouldn't be here. That's the reality where we are today.
Just to something that you said earlier, if I understood correctly, you were saying that certain things should be privatized, namely the livelihood, someone's safety over privacy. How can you ensure that lack of privacy is not going to lead to someone losing their life or someone being put in danger even more than they would have otherwise? The question of are some rights bigger than others is that's a whole different conversation. But in this case, I think when it comes to protection, it's such a complex issue that I'm really stunned that would be a statement.
It's a good question. Again, I'm quite in favor of privacy. I think it's really important. I think when we start talking about biometrics and other things, governments are going to collect information in a variety of ways. And in fact, they ought to be able to collect information to evaluate whether somebody meets the definition of refugee and whether or not they are a risk to the society. Those are legitimate functions of government. The question of how they collect that information and what the privacy protections are is a fair question. I don't want to see governments run roughshod. And I think the pendulum has gone so far to the other direction that governments are saying we want a lot of information and we're not actually going to protect people. So we're not going to take people, and we want the information. We're in the worst place we could be right now. All I'm saying is that I don't think we can say to governments, you're not entitled to have any information about who these people are, or you have to constrain the ways you collect that information in a way that's going to get them to say, all right, then we're just not going to take anybody. That's where we are today. Lots of governments are saying, basically, we'd rather not engage than take these people, and so they don't even allow anybody in. That's really the worst of all worlds to me.
Sorry. Agreed. That's also not, to what I was saying earlier, this is also not a novel case that countries like Denmark that have multiple times published an ad in Lebanese newspaper telling Syrian refugees, don't come to Denmark. Or every country, this is, again, sorry, with Turkey also and the border, these are policies that keep showing up over and over again. We keep saying, oh my God, I can't believe that Hungary is closing their borders. They've done it before too. But I think the issue is how do we break that paradigm, I guess.
To build on that and on two questions that we have on the screen, a lot of the discussion we had and a lot of justification for government for asking for more data were the recent terrorist attack. But we also know that all of the attackers were known by at least one intelligence authority. And one of the big failure of the intelligence authority there were to share the information with law enforcement or with the correct country. So instead of collecting more data about refugees and putting all the refugees into suspicion, isn't the issue of using better the data that we already have instead of asking more sensitive information?
What are we talking about here exactly? The attackers were coming from Belgium and France, is that right? They were not coming from Syria or any of the other refugee countries.
So
just to be clear.
Yes, some of the reasoning from the government were that few of their attackers have been in contact with refugees, and therefore there is suspicion, but no proof to date, that refugees are part of that movement or are planning to do some sort of attack. But that's one of the reasoning behind the issue of asking for more information. But why are we in this situation if, as you said, the attackers were Belgium and French, or if the information about them was already known? Why is more data going to make us safer? What's the reason behind that?
Well, look, there's a lot of information in the hands of one or another European government that's not shared with others. That's one problem. Another problem is that there's not enough information about who's coming in and out of Syria. That's a legitimate thing for governments to ask about, and there's not enough information about that. There's also a challenge to governments, like the U.S., as they ramp up a refugee admissions program, that they need information about who's applying. And that inevitably is going to get them to ask for more data. It's going to happen. And each government has to decide what their procedures are. But it's a legitimate thing for them to be asking, who is this sitting in the room being interviewed? And what do we know about them? And what can we know about them? That is inevitably going to create some pressures on privacy. And so I'm not saying I ignore the privacy issue. It's a real issue. But I am saying we're not even at the point where governments are ready to set up a process to invite people to come in, let alone deal with some of the questions that we're talking about here. Right now, these people are being shut out of most Western countries, and that's where I think we need to focus our energy.
We have one question at the back. I think we had a microphone in the room.
Thank you. I just wanted to weigh in very quickly on the biometrics debate. So I've spent several decades researching this, including a year on the ground in India at the very beginning of the Aadhaar. I need to make it very clear that This is not a theoretical debate at this point. The UN High Commission already tracks all refugees with biometric scans. They have a set of voluntary rules and principles that they use for this. But let's be very, very clear. Many of the countries that are installing biometric databases for refugees in particular are not doing so for their own population. Meanwhile, there are no protection laws regarding how that database is going to be used in the future. So basic fair information principles are not being applied. This is the concern. And it's not about privacy. It's actually about something further down the road, which is autonomy for these individuals. So once these databases are created, once this data is collected, that is going to follow these individuals, because I have not seen a single country at all, and I've looked and discussed this with the folks who are doing this, these programs. I've never heard of these databases shedding data. If you have, please let me know. I would like to include that on our documentation of this issue. But once the data is collected, it doesn't go away. It does follow the individuals. So 20 years henceforth, you end up with a society where there are really dual standards for people who have then become citizens. So that's a really long-term problem that needs to be addressed at the beginning of this, especially new era with a refugee crisis.
Can I ask you, have you found any government that's seriously looking at that question and thinking about standards for deleting or, taking the information offline?
The World Bank is doing a lot of work in Africa right now with a number of world-leading biometrics experts. So, for example, Chad is looking at these kinds of considerations. There are a couple of other countries in Africa that are doing it. Now, the reason they're doing it is because years ago, the UN donated voter ID equipment to a number of developing countries. That equipment was then turned around by certain government officials and made mandatory biometric IDs for the country with no data protection. And then people of various ethnicities were rounded up and treated unfairly because they had a beautiful targeting system for themselves. So some very concerned biometric experts went to the World Bank with a proposal to go into, especially the OECD nations within Africa, and say, okay, look, what can we do to correct this terrible imbalance and then to push the ball forward? So there, surprisingly enough, in Africa, that is where the most advanced discussions are taking place today.
And UNHCR?
Excuse me?
Is UNHCR
Yes.
paying attention to this?
Well, they're in the discussions, but they tend to be a bit quiet on all of these topics. To date, it's very, very difficult. I have never personally been able to get a full copy of all their rules and regulations for how they're doing, how they're effectuating the biometric database for refugees. But I do know that they did work with a group called Privacy International quite some time ago to write those rules, but it was not an open process. The process was still closed. There should have been many more organizations collaborating on those rules. It should still be subject to debate and revision with a lot of eyes on it. So we have a lot of questions about the UN right now.
Let me comment on something that you sort of touched on. UNHCR, one of the kind of emerging roles that it's playing is taking charge of IDP camps, which traditionally it has not been part of their mandate, being refugees, right? So in Syria, they are in charge of organizing and monitoring the IDP camps around Tartus, Latakia, and Homs, taking names, age, location, I mean, all the information you can think of people who have come from the north or from Dara or from Ghouta to live in these IDP camps, which are former schools or shelters. That data is on a computer with no password. That is completely available to anybody from the regime, anybody who, you don't even hack into it. You can literally just go to the computer and look at all of this data. Can you imagine what kind of a catastrophe that is like waiting to happen? UNHCR really needs to step up and understand what kind of, that we're living in 2016, that we're putting people into tremendous danger. This is not just privacy, this is direct physical danger that we're putting people into. And UNHCR is not a country. They are not they don't owe anybody anything. Their
I-
boss is UNHCR.
I couldn't agree more. And we found the exact same practices. There was one particular case in a country where it was a very brutal regime, and they had a server that was accessed by the opposition, and it was just devastating for families of refugees who were still within the, outside of the political line. So that is a continuing problem. And what we found just from working in the field is that it's very, very spotty. Some people are really good. They'll encrypt end to end. They'll take a lot of good countermeasures and put in a lot of hurdles. But there are way too many lapses out in the field, just as you have discussed. We've not found anything that is at all even looking like a full-scale effort to teach everyone what modern practices are. I think this is fixable, though, what you've discussed. I agree with you, but it's fixable somehow.
I think, unfortunately, we'll have to wrap up the discussion. So we've been discussing extensively the role of government and their poor or lack of support for refugees in terms of human rights protection, in terms of privacy. One element that we probably have to consider as we continue this discussion over the next weeks and months is also the role that private companies can have in either helping the refugees or also the role that they can sometimes play in surveillance. That's something that is broadly discussed in the surveillance context in general. I would like to thank you all for being there, and please help me thank the panelists for their brilliant contribution to this morning session. The program at Rights can continue, and we hope to continue these debates with you. Thank you.